What most often causes division isn't the differences of what most of us believe deep down. It's the differences in what we think the other person believes. That is a quote from today's guest. He holds instructor level credentials in Lu Xiong Gung Fu. He has scores of hours of force on force, live fire, and simulation training through MDTS, ShivWorks, Progressive Force Concepts, Rochester Personal Defense, and Insights training. He has himself conducted hundreds of hours of interviews with the likes of Massad Ayoob, Peyton Quinn, and Rich Nance. He's written best-selling books on everything from knife fighting, home defense, improvised weapons, and was a longtime contributor to Tactical Knives magazine and Survivor's Edge. He's had his finger on the pulse of the self-defense industry and been a subtly guiding presence in the zeitgeist for 15 years. He's one of the busiest people I know, so I thank him for taking some time to do this today. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Phil Elmore.
A subtly guiding hand of the zeitgeist. That's
yes.
it's going to be hard to live up to that.
Yeah, well, the bar has been set. You must live up to it now. Yes. All right. I want to take it back all the way to April 1st of 2007 when this little book called Street Sword came out. This was actually a birthday present that same year from my mother, who thought she saw it on a shelf and thought, oh, well, I got to get that. And it actually, that book is what opened my mind to the use of the katana in a more practical, less classical sense.
So this was before we knew each other?
This was before we knew each other.
Oh, wild.
And, well, I'll cut to the chase. A couple of years ago, I just got off the phone with you, and I was walking by my bookshelf, and I saw the spine of that book, and then I realized, wait a minute, that's the guy I just got off the phone with, and I had completely forgotten about that book. So, lo and behold, here we are. Life is funny. That's how it works. Yeah,
the book has achieved a kind of pop culture infamy that I never would have expected. I mean, that show At Midnight, which is hosted by, or I don't even know if it still exists, but it was the guy from the Walking Dead talk show, Chris Hardwick.
Yes.
He hosted that show. He made fun of that book. The book has been on the Worst Things for Sale. It's been on the front page of break.com. It's been made fun of just about everywhere it could be, because, of course, it is such a perfectly ridiculous title, a title that, ironically enough, I did not select and which does not reflect the contents of the book. When I wrote the book, my goal was to create just a basic treatise on basic swordsmanship. That's all it is. You know, the least you need to know to use a sword to deliver force. And Paladin sent me a list of the titles that they would accept, and Street Sword was the least awful of them. I've always felt like they didn't market the book consistently with what was inside it, guaranteeing that people look at the cover and they look at the title and they laugh at it, but none of them have ever actually read it. The inside of the book's really unremarkable. It's just basic mechanics. I think Stephen Dick over at Tactical Knives reviewed the book when it came out, and it was a good review, but it was nothing terribly exciting. I think if I remember correctly, he even acknowledged that at the time there was a flap among Japanese martial arts people, and really what he was referring to is the fact that the folks at ebudo.com, which was a predominantly Japanese martial arts website, they banned me from their forum for publishing that book. Like, I was legitimately banned from a forum back in the days when forums were everything.
Yeah.
For having been the author of that book. So,
well,
I've been really amazed. Like, periodically, I will go on Twitter and just search for Street Sword and find people talking about the book. And so I'll jump into their conversations, and then everyone's like, the author. I'm like, yeah, that book is so old. I had hair when I wrote it. So, it's been. I don't know if very few people are blessed to have achieved something like that. It was really just a gift by the universe to me that, because I was going to follow that old model of you publish a book or two in Paladin Press. My first book was Flashlight Fighting, which is about, I think it was the first book of its type at the time about using a flashlight as a striking tool. Not a big flashlight, but a small flashlight. And it's just Japanese Yawara techniques adapted to small flashlights. That's all it is. And that book was well received. It sold quite well. I used to get great royalty checks out of that, although I made more money as a freelance editor for Paladin than I ever did as an author. And the book, we made the transition to Street Sword. Like I pitched them the second book, Street Sword, and they weren't certain. I remember I had to prepare like a small brief on the concept of the book. And then they accepted it, and then they hung that dumb title on it. But then it circled back around and did me this wonderful gift of being kind of the thing that allowed people to discover me. Life is not without a sense of irony. I am a best-selling author. My best-selling book, legitimately like top 10 on Amazon, is a book on CPAP machines. Yes. So I was going to follow that Paladin model, and I was going to publish some Paladin Press books, and then I was going to branch out and do my own thing and get famous for doing self-defense stuff. And the universe said, no, you're going to get famous for almost dying in your sleep, and then not doing that. Yeah. So,
well, we always think we know. We always have a plan, don't we? But yeah, and that was actually going to be my next question is, so you wrote this little book called 10 Things Your Doctor Won't Tell You about your CPAP. And well, you just described how that happened.
Well, when I first, I was sick, and then I had some other problems. Then I got bronchitis, and then I had pneumonia. And finally, I went back to my doctor, and I said, I'm not getting better. When I go up the stairs, I legitimately feel like I'm about to pass out. Something's wrong. And it's more than just I'm fat. Like this is I've been fat for a long time. This is a level above. And he looked at me and he said, well, it could be your heart. And I said, what? Well, they did a bunch of tests and they found out that, yes, it was. When you don't get enough oxygen in your sleep, it can do actual damage to your organs. And my heart was suffering. They told me I had cardiomyopathy, which is Latin for crappy heart. Your heart is crappy. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? It means it's crappy. It's not pushing enough blood. Well, how long has it been that way? We don't know. Will it get better? We don't know.
Yeah.
Do you know exactly what did it? No, we don't.
Yeah.
So I did a sleep study, and they said, okay, what you need is air while you're sleeping. Because when you have sleep apnea, your airway closes. And a lot of people associate that with being overweight. But I asked, like, if I just lose 100 pounds, will this fix itself? And they said, no. Often it has to do with how your airway is, the muscles of your airway. Losing weight might help, but probably won't. And most of the people in my sleep study were not fat people like me. They were small.
Right.
So they gave me the CPAP machine, and this was a long process. Well, what I discovered after 3 days of trying to adjust to sleeping with this thing on my head was I couldn't do it. I didn't sleep for 3 days. And you'd be amazed how fast you come unraveled when you don't sleep for 3 days straight. I thought the joy of sleeping had been taken away from me forever. And I went into the sleep clinic on the third day, and I was out of my mind. I said, if you don't find a way to help me, I will throw myself off a building. And to his credit, the guy was like, well, let's see if we can't make some adjustments. Meanwhile, the lady in the office next door fled. I had to apologize to her later for scaring her. That's how unraveled I was, because you don't know how nuts you're going to get until you don't sleep. And I literally for 72 hours had not slept at all. So what they did was they switched the mask. And when they switched the mask type so that I could breathe through my mouth if I needed to, all of a sudden I was able to adjust almost immediately. And I've been using the CPAP for years, ever since. It's amazing when you haven't slept for years properly. When you suddenly do, you're like, wait, what's different? Oh, I don't hate everyone.
Yeah.
And it's like the cartoon music starts playing, la 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 la, and the birds are singing, and
animals,
cartoon woodland animals are hopping through the forest. But then it occurred to me that the transition was so hard, and there was so much adjustment. There were so many things I wish someone had told me. So I sat down and I wrote a booklet, just a 99-cent booklet, that included all the things I wish someone had taken the time to tell me. Yeah. And armed with that knowledge, I think anyone's transition to getting used to a CPAP machine would be much easier. And the fact that the booklet has done so well for so many years, because typically a book will do well initially, and then the older it gets, the more it'll taper off. And I still see sales of that book every month to this day. So, and it was the book that made me a best-selling author. So I hope it's helped people. It's got hundreds of reviews on Amazon. They're all organic. I never went soliciting reviews for that. Some of the negative reviews have been fun too, because there are some people who, I don't think they're trolls. I don't think they're out to get me personally. They don't know me. But I feel like the book they're reviewing is not the book that I wrote. Like somebody wrote, "This is scare tactics." And I'm like, it's what? Like, no, I'm just telling you what happened so you can avoid it. Like, I don't understand that reaction, but.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people of all ages and heights and all kinds of other related, uh, I guess you'd say, comorbidities. Some folks who are mentally disabled, everybody you can think of might need a CPAP at some time. So there is no demographic for it.
It changed my life for the better. I mean, I never sleep without it ever. I even have a travel one because I won't even go a day. I tried once. What's that?
It's amazing how small they're getting compared
to
just a few years.
I keep seeing ads for it's just a little nose piece thing, supposedly, but there's no way the physics of that work. That tiny machine cannot generate the pressure that is required. That thing is a ripoff. I don't know. I don't understand how it still gets advertised because we don't have that technology yet. Once we do, that'd be awesome. But even the smallest CPAP machines are about the size of a box of Kleenex. They don't get much smaller.
Which at least you don't have to wheel them around anymore. But yeah.
Well, fortunately my interaction with them subsequent to that era, but yeah, the technology's gotten a lot better and will continue to get better. It's unfortunate that you have to have a prescription to buy it because it's kind of a hassle. Like now that I know I need one, to have to upload a prescription for it every time I buy one, because I'm well past the point where insurance is involved. I've bought machines myself so that I have duplicate machines, and I have the travel one that I bought, and it's annoying to have to deal with the prescription nature of it, but I understand the logic because there are hypochondriacs out there who would start using CPAP. There aren't too many negative side effects associated with using a CPAP when you don't need one, with the possible exception of it could weaken your airway unnecessarily because you're not using those muscles. It's not like being on the CPAP has done my airway any benefit.
Okay. So the purpose of this show is to be helpful in some capacity to the audience and maybe glean some practical methods and methodology of the professional at hand. So let's talk writing. That is what you do. Something you have helped me a lot with is brevity and not wasting words or doing my best not to. And I still think the art of brevity, an ironically long book, is a good idea. But anyway, when you're sort of delineating a concept and then boiling it down to something that is palatable for the average person, is it an automatic process? Do you go through drafting phases, or does your brain just immediately go to the correct size of document or post?
It really depends on the project. Like most of the novels that I wrote when I was writing for the Executioner series for Harlequin, those were all one-take wonders. Like I just sat down, wrote them, and I was done. And then their editors did whatever they wanted to them. And I think that's part of why I didn't worry too much about going back over it, because I knew they would change things, even things that were unnecessary, just because, like, one book I concluded in a bar and they changed it to a diner, complete with descriptions of a diner that never existed that I didn't write. And I remember thinking, well, that's a weird thing to change. Like, you just got done reading 60,000 words of a guy shooting terrorists in the face, but we wouldn't want to set foot in a bar. That might be inappropriate.
Yeah.
So, it always struck me as odd, the things they chose to change. There were something, once in a while, they'd come to me, the editor would come to me and say, this is a little too brutal. Could you not? And I'm like, yeah, I can fix that. But most projects, there's an old saying that, I'm sorry this is so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter. So it's easy to write off the top of your head and have it be as long as it is. Mm-hmm. To distill it down takes more time. As a working writer, as somebody who makes a living off the sweat of my brain, I have so much practice doing that I don't usually have to do too many drafts of the same piece of writing, unless maybe I'm writing something to a specific word count and I get it out and I look at the count and I'm like, okay, that's way too long.
Yeah.
So it really is project dependent. When you've done this enough times and a project is presented to you and it's presented in a certain way, then it's relatively easy to determine what where your starting point is. So like if I'm documenting a piece of machinery, or I'm writing a blog post, or I'm writing a piece of fiction, these are all different things, but I've done them enough times that I know pretty much how to frame it. So there's not a lot of extra work on the back end, but that's just a function of experience. No one should ever feel bad about doing multiple drafts. With writing, there's no right or wrong. There's no, you did this wrong and you're bad at it. Well, everyone asks me, anyone who's ever asked me, how do I get into technical writing, or how do I get into writing in general? I tell them you write and you do it a lot and you practice, because I started out as an amateur. I've had the benefit of on-the-job training as a technical writer for many years, and I've had the benefit of training doing fiction, working with an intellectual property development company, which was kind of like an intensive years-long process of learning to get better. But at the end of the day, I started out, I started waving my arms around going, I am a writer. And then people gave me work, and then I got better at it. I like to say, for instance, when it comes to novels, you only get one first novel and they're all terrible. You've got to get it out of you.
Yeah.
Your subsequent novel will be less terrible, but probably not great. There's only a few people who hit it out of the park on the first try. J.K. Rowling, probably a great example of. She wrote one relatively short book, which was that first Harry Potter book, and it was brilliant. But most of the time, that first book is awful. Even there's a thriller writer named Matthew Riley, who's written a bunch of action novels featuring a military character nicknamed Scarecrow. And he wrote a science fiction novel about it's almost like a battle royale in the New York Public Library overnight, as interdimensional gates open and people are, I don't know, fighting for the fate of the planet. It's very Mortal Kombat in its kind of premise. But he wrote in the foreword to the published version of that book that I read that he had originally written this book and self-published it, and it was terrible. I don't know if he said it was terrible, but that's what I got between the lines. So by the time it actually made publication, he was already a successful author, and he went back and rewrote that book extensively in order to make it better. As a writer, if you are not capable of looking at your early work and going, ugh, then there's something wrong, because you should hate your earlier stuff. It should be bad by comparison to what you're capable of doing now. I do writing coaching, and one of my students is a 17-year-old girl who is the daughter of a friend of mine who wants to be a writer. And she's more talented at 17, and she started when she was 16, than most adult, well, not most. There are many adult clients I've had who were working with less than this girl is working with. She's doing great. And in order for her to progress, she had to learn what I was teaching her and then apply it and continue to do better. Well, at one point, she looked at some of her earlier stuff and said, oh, I really hate this. I said, good. That is a sign of real progress if you can look at your early work and hate it. Because I have also worked with adults who had crapped out hundreds of thousands of words and were really proud of that number, and yet hadn't managed to get better in all that practice. Which is partly a failure of feedback, but may also be a failure of willingness to accept feedback. It was once the case that the fastest way to make me angry was to criticize my writing. I mentioned that to the IP development company that I was working with, and the fellow there said, well, you're going to have to get over that real fast. And he was right. Learning to accept criticism and do better was the key to becoming a better writer, because there's no right way to write, especially when it comes to fiction, but there's more skillful writing, and then there's less skillful writing. And anyone who starts out as an amateur, yes, your books will be less skillful. They will not be good. You may think at the time that they're great. They're not. And you'll look back at them later and go, oh, yeah, that wasn't good. But you thought it was at the time, and that's okay. Yeah. Everyone goes through that phase.
Yeah. I think of it like a martial art or any new skill. Like, first you got to develop the circuit so that you can come up with, or you can process things, organize things, and then express things, and develop your circuit. And then you can look at actual content. So like, to even start, you have to develop that ability to write. And then you can maybe start to look at the rights and wrongs of what I'm doing, what I could do better based on feedback. So I know exactly what you're talking about because I look back at a lot of things, even tiny things that I have typed, and it's like, ugh. So yeah.
It's a natural part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel tremendously blessed at all the opportunities that I have had. And I'm still relatively low down on the tree in terms of opportunity. I've never had a major, I've been published commercially by a major publisher, but it's not like, the type of commercial success that comes from having your own hit book. Like, the fellow who wrote The Martian, who started out as a self-published author and eventually, reached the highest pinnacle of financial success, or people whose books got picked up by quote unquote real publishers the traditional way, it's weird because the barrier to becoming a published fiction author is it's so low, anyone can do it now. But the benefit is most people will never see any benefit from that. Yes, you published your book on Amazon and 17 people will read it. Most of them are your relatives,
There was have you seen, Keanu Reeves made a documentary a long time ago now called Side by Side. And he was examining the new developments in film and how the move from celluloid to digital filming. And one of the conclusions was that, yes, now anyone with digital filming, anyone and their dog is going to be putting out content because it's easier to produce, it's cheaper to produce. But because of that, you're going to have a lot more junk.
Yeah.
Because there's less pressure and less, but
well,
the potential for it has limitless potential though. So it's a double-edged sword.
And that's what Publish on Demand did for the publishing industry. When the first Publish on Demand houses came out, and that's how I published my first novel, they were using technology that allowed them to print the books as they were bought, so they didn't have to carry an inventory. So suddenly it was possible to publish books that you didn't really, you weren't individually making money on. There's no advance to the author. The author gets a cut, you get a bigger cut as the publisher, and that's that. And then publishing companies started using the same technology. Paladin Press, which was always a small print company, they switched to the same technology that Publish on Demand was using in an attempt to stay in business. Ultimately, they still were not successful. They just weren't able to make enough money to stay afloat. And the dirty little secret is Paladin Press's authors never really made much money because the royalties on those books, even if your book sold well, was relatively little money. Like I said, I made more money freelance editing for them than I ever did as in royalties as an author. But it was seen at one time as a gateway to success. Back in the mail order days, you publish your book or your video through Paladin, or maybe you put out a TRS video, and that was your stepping stone to be able to put out your own stuff. Because now you have an audience of people who are following you, following your website, they're going to your forum, all those things that existed in the 90s. And the industry's really changed. And I had a conversation with a friend the other day about personalities from like the 80s and 90s mail order days who are now getting so old that they're starting to die off. Larry Wick died very young from cancer. He was the fellow over at Split Second Survival, and he was one of the first personalities that I knew from that era who passed away. But there are others who are really getting up there now. And, it's a shame. It'll be a shame to see them go. But compared to those tape and mail order catalog guys, you've got this new generation of people who are essentially internet marketers. So, people like Luke Holloway, who puts out Instagram videos and online training and stuff. Somebody asked me, what do you think of Luke Holloway? I'm like, I have no idea. I have no earthly idea. Yeah. I've seen his videos, I've seen the ads, and I'm not sure. And so that's a new generation of tech savvy, sort of online adept marketers. And that's really what they are, is marketing. Now, you could argue that these self-defense personalities were always marketers, but it was really only marketing to become self-defense figures. People used to be much more iconic back in the day, maybe because there was fewer of them. These days, anybody can market themselves and become an internet marketer and put out content. And that term, you used it yourself, content. It has this implication. It's stuff. It doesn't even have to be particularly groundbreaking. It's just a feed, a stream of things that we consume. Oh, I like knife stuff. I want to consume knife stuff. Here's a channel full of knife stuff, and I will now consume it. Did any of it change my life? Maybe in the aggregate, but I'm not going to be able to point to any one video and go, this was brilliant. And so it's a very different model now. It's sort of a continuum of instruction as opposed to discrete, published, edited, polished works.
Right.
And is that good or bad? I don't know. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's just how it is.
Yeah, double-edged sword. But Paladin, that's a great example to me of, well, number one, yeah, it was the process was more complex in getting content out. And Paladin, which you're kind of like the last of the old guard in a way, or one of the last of the old guard.
I am one of the OGs of the online self-defense world, and there were many of them. But it occurred to me one day that I was one. I'm like, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
And you know what did it? It was when somebody left a comment on my Instagram account that said, this guy wrote books that I read when I was a kid. And I was simultaneously really flattered and then really pained.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, you who are a functioning adult now read my book when you were a kid. I'll just be in the corner rapidly aging.
Yeah. But anyway, Paladin that's an example of, like, if you bought one Paladin book, and also that everything about their marketing was somebody was good at their job, because it stuck in your mind. It was a great name. It was immediately recognizable, and people that liked, like one guy that liked Systema, that bought some guy's book on boiling that down, would still buy Street Sword or whatever because Paladin produced it.
Well, the other thing about that model was, if your only exposure to someone was of books that were produced at that level, because Paladin knew what it was doing when it came to laying out these books and presenting them. They were all professionally done. So like my first introduction to the works of Sammy Franco were a couple of books that Paladin put out. And you read those books and you get the impression that this guy knows what he's doing. You know, he's a relatively tough guy in that mold. He's got the knowledge, and these books are worthwhile. And then you see video of Sammy Franco for the first time, and you're like, this is not that.
Yeah.
And I say that as someone who has I'm not objective, because Sammy was kind of a jerk to me, which I gather is not a rare story. And I'm hopeful that enough water has gone under the bridge that someone who likes him is not going to watch this and go shake their fist at me and be mad at me. But, you know, he was a jerk. You know, but at the same time, like his in-person presence was way different than the impression you get from those books, to his benefit if you had only ever interacted with his material through those books. You know, about the time he announced that he was no longer going to be teaching women, and he started putting out books about, you know, the warriors that he was like, it just made me think of Airplane. Like, do you like movies about gladiators, Billy?
Oh.
You know, it's like,
okay.
you do you, man, but okay. So the fact is, and I'm kind of brushing up against it here, there's a lot of weirdos, and I'm not saying he's one of them. I'm saying that in the self-defense world, there are a lot of idiosyncratic and weird people. And even a lot of the people that I like tend to be a little bit odd. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's nobody who looks at anything I do and thinks, well, that's a perfectly normal, sane person. You know, we're all a little strange in some way. I like to think my oddness is in boring ways, but who knows? And there's a lot of personalities who I really like, who are into some odd stuff. You know, people whose work I love and respect, and just as people, they tend to be a little out there, and I love them for it. You know, so that too is a double-edged sword, because it can be off-putting to a younger, more sensitive generation that feels like if they don't agree with absolutely everything someone says, then they couldn't possibly consume the quote-unquote content that this person is putting out. And so I think that younger generation misses out on a lot, because they look at all of us weirdos and go, yeah, not so much.
Yeah. Well, I hit a place where I decided, I'm not sure if you're talking about me, but I guess I'd certainly fall into that category.
Well, that's just it. I could be talking about anyone. I could be talking about me. I could be talking about literally anyone in the industry.
That's quite true, actually. I hadn't actually thought of that till. We all just think we're more weird than the next guy, but if you look objectively, really? Okay.
Well, and I think partly that's what's missing. There are so many broken personalities in this field. And here I'm thinking not of the people that I like and respect, but of the sort of second tier of people who are definitely not all there and who have played a little fast and loose with their credentials. And, people
Yeah.
like, it's not enough that you're teaching people wrestling. You have to tell them that you're teaching them some recreation of the ancient Roman gladiators. Here I'm thinking of a specific personality, or those guys who said they were doing ancient Egyptian martial arts, the Haikuta people.
Haikuta. Yes.
Yes. And there's so many examples of stuff like that. Like, it wasn't enough for you to just do what you're doing. You had to also embellish.